The next nuclear crisis, Iran, Israel, and the race to the unthinkably as missiles fly and diplomacy fails, is the world sleepwalking into another nuclear age. With tensions between Iran and Israel reaching a boiling point, the global community is now staring down a terrifying prospect: the emergence of a new nuclear state in the heart of the Middle East. In her in-depth report, Christiane Amanpour explores this delicate, high-stakes dilemma, asking a question that could redefine global security: will Iran now build a nuclear bomb? This report dissects the geopolitical, economic, and human costs of the unfolding crisis. From the breakdown of diplomatic trust to the shadow of military escalation, we examine how this moment fits into a broader historical context and why it could determine not just regional outcomes, but the stability of the entire international system. Years of international negotiations to curb Iran's nuclear program appear to be unraveling. The 2015 Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action (JCPOA), once hailed as a diplomatic triumph, now lies in tatters after the U.S. withdrawal in 2018 and Iran's subsequent breaches. As Amanpour details, Tehran is now enriching uranium to levels just below weapons grade, while signaling its willingness to go further if provoked. Israel, long convinced that a nuclear Iran poses an existential threat, has made clear it will not tolerate such a development. Prime Minister Netanyahu recently reiterated that all options are on the table, a veiled reference to potential preemptive military strikes. With Washington distracted by domestic concerns and a divided Congress, the absence of a unified Western response further emboldens Iran's leadership. Diplomatic efforts through the UN and European channels have stalled. Amanpour's sources suggest that back-channel talks continue, but trust has eroded on all sides. In this vacuum, regional players including Saudi Arabia, Egypt, and Turkey are quietly reassessing their own nuclear policies, potentially igniting a regional arms race. A nuclear-capable Iran would have profound consequences for global energy and economic security. Oil prices are already reacting to increased tension in the Gulf, with Brent crude nearing $100 per barrel. Any further instability in the Strait of Hormuz, through which one-fifth of global oil passes, could send markets into turmoil. Sanctions have crippled the Iranian economy, yet they've failed to deter the country's nuclear ambitions. Tehran has adapted, forming strategic partnerships with China and Russia, both of whom are keen to reduce Western influence in the region. As Amanpour's report notes, this realignment may grant Iran just enough economic breathing room to accelerate its nuclear capabilities without fully isolating itself. Meanwhile, defense stocks are climbing, signaling investor anticipation of sustained conflict or even limited war. European nations, particularly those reliant on Gulf oil, are bracing for increased energy costs and a possible refugee influx should the conflict explode. The global economy, already fragile from inflation and post-pandemic recovery, cannot afford another prolonged geopolitical crisis in the Middle East. Historical context. The ghost of nonproliferation past. What makes the current moment uniquely dangerous is that it mirrors other critical inflection points in nuclear history. Much like North Korea in the early 2000s, Iran is testing the resolve of the international community. But unlike North Korea, Iran operates in a region dense with proxy conflicts, fragile governments, and overlapping rivalries. The US and Israel have both used covert operation cyber attacks, targeted assassinations, sabotage to slow Iran's program. But those methods have only bought time, not reversed Tehran's trajectory. Amanpour's interviews with former diplomats suggest that the West's reliance on tactical containment without a long-term strategy has created a vacuum one Iran is now poised to fill. Israel's nuclear ambiguity, Saudi Arabia's aspirations, and Turkey's regional ambitions all complicate the landscape. The potential breakdown of the Treaty on the Non-Proliferation of Nuclear Weapons (NPT) could usher in a new era of proliferation not just in the Middle East, but globally. This isn't just a regional dilemma, it's a global precedent in the making. While leaders argue and strategists plan, civilians are the ones who suffer. In Iran, decades of sanctions, internal repression, and economic isolation have created widespread poverty and social unrest. Many Iranians oppose the government's nuclear ambitions, believing they come at the expense of healthcare, education, and daily survival. In Israel, military preparedness has become a way of life. Public shelters, missile defense systems, and psychological trauma drills are normalized in schools and communities. With Hezbollah in Lebanon and militias in Syria on high alert, the threat of a multi-front conflict looms. If war breaks out, the toll in human lives could be catastrophic, especially among the most vulnerable. Refugee flows from Iraq, Syria, and Afghanistan have already strained regional infrastructure. A new conflict could displace millions more. Humanitarian organizations are preparing contingency plans, but access to high-risk zones will be limited. If diplomacy fails, the human cost won't just be a tragic side story, it will be the main one. The question Amanpour poses, will Iran now build a bomb, is no longer theoretical. It's a real possibility, with real implications. The international community faces a stark choice: re-engage with serious diplomacy now or prepare for a world where nuclear weapons are no longer the exception, but the norm. The stakes could not be higher. This is about more than Tehran and Tel Aviv. It's about whether the world can still contain its most dangerous impulses, or whether, once again, the lesson will come too late. Watch the full documentary here. Will Iran now build a bomb?
You can disagree with all your might, but you can also be an Iranian who loves your country and be very concerned, worried, pained by what you're seeing happening, especially to civilians.
And I think they are in dreamo vision if they think this war is just going to magically end with the Iranians capitulating. That's not what extremist regimes do.
Hello and welcome to the X-Files with me, Christiane Amanpour.
And I'm Jamie Rubin, a two-time senior State Department official under Presidents Clinton and Biden.
You see, it took you a while to remember that. I am Christiane Amanpour. I'm actually at my CNN office today because there's so much going on. And I am a long-time correspondent for CNN, covered all the wars and crises for the last 35 years. And now I have my own show here where I attempt to hold world leaders accountable, including and especially right now in this new war that has been unleashed in the Middle East.
And I'm sitting here from Carmela's Kitchen, as I call it, which is in Long Island.
And look, it's called the X-Files because we are exes. We were married for 20 years, divorced 7, and we just decided to reopen this conversation because, at first I said desperate times call for desperate measures, and we are indeed in very heightened times right now. So we do need to have, a conversation about this and where it's all going. And of course, this is being recorded on Monday, June 23rd, just after the weekend strikes by the United States. And as Israel continues its strikes and expands its target list to really hitting internal regime targets. What does that all mean? We're going to find out in this episode. And the big question right now, don't you agree, Jamie, is in the aftermath of these massive, the MOP bomb, 30,000-pound bombs that were dropped on these enrichment sites, is how Iran is going to retaliate.
Right. I think we're going to get some reaction. It's very hard to predict how strong and how comprehensive and how dangerous it will be. But there is going to be a reaction. I don't think the regime can survive without reacting in some respects. When Trump killed Soleimani, the leader of the Iranian IRGC, they reacted by using their proxy in Iraq to attack an American military base. So they have options in the following sense. There's the Houthis. They could empower. The Houthis have a capability to shut down the region's shipping. They could mine the Straits of Hormuz or the Gulf of Oman. And then they could activate terrorism, asymmetrical warfare. And what we need to remember here is something people forget. Iran is an agent of chaos, this regime. And in that sense, they've retained inside Iran the leader of al-Qaeda. I believe his name is Saif al-Adil, who is in Iran under their protection, and they could weaponize al-Qaeda, and al-Qaeda has shown in the past an ability to conduct terrorist attacks.
Can we just really go into that, because they are against al-Qaeda as we saw, and they've got him either in jail or house arrest. He's been there practically since 9/11. Why would he be? Because the Iranians were complicit, or not complicit, agreed to the US taking out the Taliban al-Qaeda's clients in Afghanistan.
That was a different era when there was some cooperative discussions between the United States and Iran over Afghanistan. If you remember, James Dobbins, our envoy, talked to the Iranians, and we were able to put together a government in Afghanistan after the fall of the Taliban. Now all bets are off. Look, al-Qaeda's leadership is in Iran. Iran has maintained their presence there as a tool, as a threat, as a device, as an option they can use against the world. That's why they're there. Now, having been attacked by the United States, it's possible they would activate that. That's what I'm saying.
I assume you know that because of intelligence from your time in government. But I actually want to ask about the intelligence because you mentioned it at the beginning, and this goes to the heart of the casus belli, if you like. The Israelis and now Trump have been just saying that, they were this close to getting the bomb. And again, just lay out what U.S. intelligence says. And then I want to talk about how much damage they may or may not have done to the enrichment facilities.
Well, when talking about the intelligence on weapons of mass destruction, given our fiasco in Iraq, it's very important to be as precise as possible. Intelligence can always be exaggerated, can always be slightly adjusted to make a political point. I'm not interested in that, so I'm going to tell you what I know and what has been now, I think, pretty much affirmed publicly. And that is that they were expanding their capability by expanding their ability to have uranium enriched to 90% in sufficient quantities to construct a weapon. But there is something called weaponization, where you take that enriched uranium and you weaponize it. You may use uranium metal in a actual device. Then that implosion has to be occurred, and then you frankly have to test it. Iran wasn't doing those things. They were thinking about it and doing some modest testing back 20 years ago, but then they made a decision to stop weaponization. They wanted the capability. Remember, enriched uranium to 60%, it has no value for civilian nuclear purposes. They were doing it as a threat. And this is where Iran's policy of chickens coming home to roost. They were threatening the world with their nuclear capability, and they reached a point where, in the aftermath of October 7th, Israel finally decided to do something about that threat because diplomacy wasn't working.
Okay.
The problem here is that the best way to prevent Iran from becoming a nuclear weapons state, to actually testing a weapon, is diplomacy, is having a diplomatic agreement with inspectors on the ground. So you know where everything is. You know that the program is contained and it is not being weaponized. You can't do that from the air. You can't do that from afar.
Okay.
And in the end, if Trump wants to succeed in denuclearizing Iran, he's going to have to move to diplomacy with inspections.
Right. So a lot to unpack there. And let's just say that the immediate issue of what have they done to these nuclear enrichment facilities is unclear, because we're getting all sorts of different commentary from Israel, from the US, from within the US administration. Trump himself, on the eve when he announced the bombing raids by the B-2s, said that they had been completely obliterated. And now not likely. And now his own cabinet people are basically saying, well, maybe not obliterated, but severely damaged. Somebody else said, we've taken them off the table. Others said, and this is all within the administration, that perhaps we've delayed the program, by, I think, 2 years to 5 years. And I will say that the former chairman of the Joint Chiefs, Admiral Mike Mullen, had told me just before this bombing raid that, everybody's hyped up about the MOP and the 30,000 pound bomb, but we've never ever deployed it. And there is a lot of unknowns about whether it can actually do what we think it can. And the depth of the location at Fordo is so deep, they don't know. They have no full battle, BDA, battle damage assessment yet, and they don't know exactly. And then the possibility is that Iran could have moved its stockpiles of enriched uranium anyway, and that also they might, according to another expert who told me, they might be able to have salvaged some centrifuges before all this happened, enough centrifuges, and that will determine their response. And I found that very, very interesting. I found it very interesting that he said that. If they feel they have enough of that program left, it could determine their response. And I assume he means by potentially going underground with an out of inspection view. But before we get there, because you've talked about it a little bit, it must be inspected, all of this. You said a failure of diplomacy, or rather, only way diplomacy could work. And look, I mean, it's a truism. You don't have to be a genius to know that the Iranians were, deliberately deceived by the United States and Israel. They thought they were going to another round of negotiations with the United States. And Israel decided to preemptively strike because it had that time. Then Trump apparently, and he said it, and his sources in his administration are now telling reporters that he said, I'll make up my mind within 2 weeks about whether to use the B-2s. This is what he said on Thursday, knowing that he was going to do it and wanting the time to be able to do it so that Iran was, again, unaware of anything happening. But just Aragshi said, this completely puts paid to anybody's trust in negotiations and diplomacy. What do you think about that?
Well, the Iranians have a lot of nerve blaming everyone else for their problems.
No, but on this issue, let's just take it on this issue
specifically.
Is there any comparison?
Let me address your question.
No, this is really important. Is there any comparison when, a nation, let's say the United States during the first Gulf War, they actually developed a coalition, went for about 6 months of diplomacy, and then gave Iraq a fixed deadline. 2 months or however many months before. This one was strike under potentially a deception over diplomacy.
Look, I'm not going to parse Donald Trump's games. It was within 2 weeks, if you really want to parse it. He did it within a couple days, not 2 weeks. That's not really the point here. The point here is that Iran's chickens are coming home to roost. Before Israel struck Iran, the IAEA made a declaration, the entire board of the IAEA, declaring in paragraph 3 of their action item that Iran's behavior constitutes non-compliance with its obligations under safeguards agreements with this organization. They provoked this crisis by not cooperating with the IAEA and by threatening to go nuclear every day by enriching uranium to a higher and higher degree. That's the game they were playing, and it's now blown up in their face. So they were playing their own games. Trump plays his games. That's not really the point. The point here is that without diplomacy, without inspections over the long term, we will never know where Iran stands in terms of nuclear weapons capability. They could have put centrifuges in many locations around the country. They could have taken the 60% enriched uranium and removed it from Fordo, which reports suggest they did, and then further enrich it to 90%, which is not very hard. The hard part, it's a reverse equation. The hard part is to go from 10 to 20. Once you're at 60, it's very easy to go to 90. And so if they do that, then they will have the nuclear material that they can weaponize. That's not that hard. A graduate student in physics knows the physics of weaponizing nuclear material if you have it to 90%. So that's what we're facing, a covert program without diplomacy, without an agreement. And this is how North Korea went nuclear. The West adopted a maximalist strategy, demanding that they surrender and give up all their stuff, and demanding, basically a capitulation from North Korea. And North Korea said, yeah, watch this. And they pulled out of the NPT, they removed their material, and then they tested a nuclear device. And that has brought them a level of security, because people are reluctant to attack North Korea because they have nuclear weapons.
Okay,
Did we just do that by attacking Iran? That's the hard question that neither Trump nor J.D. Vance nor the IAEA nor anyone knows the answer to right now. The Iranians probably don't even know it. They're probably figuring out what they have and where it is and what they can do about it.
And whether they can survive, because Israel has massively expanded its targets and it's hitting, domestic targets now, as well as presumably perhaps some, military and nuclear still, but upped its game. It's actually hit northern Iran. It's very close to where my house northern Tehran, the capital, very close to where I grew up. Evin prison is literally almost next door to the riding stables I used to go to. I did not know the prison was that kind of prison at that time. But I know exactly where it is. And right now it's very densely populated. And my question is, Did they evacuate the prisoners, many of whom, not all, but many of whom are actually political prisoners and opponents of the current regime? So this is a big question. And it seems to be that Israel is upping the ante, and you can see it on its tweets, on its messages, on everything, for regime change. And Trump has now posted about that, having said point blank that this is not about regime change, or at least his administration officials.
But what we shouldn't forget, and what's worth mentioning here, as the United States faces war with Iran, and Israel is at war with Iran, is that the Iranian chickens regionally are coming home to roost. Remember, this is a regime that backed Assad in Syria, who killed 500,000 Sunnis who were trying to simply have their freedom. And Iran enabled Assad to stay in power. They have undermined the Lebanese government. They have undermined the Iraqi government. And they have been provoking the world since the day they started chanting death to America and death to Israel. Remember, these extremists play off each other. So when Iran's regime promotes the idea of death to America, death to America, death to Israel, then the extremists in Israel and the United States pick that up and say, look, they want to kill us all.
And how do you read it?
Well, I believe that that's a regime rap, but they've organized themselves in opposition to the United States. It's been a central feature of their foreign policy from the beginning, is to be opposed to the United States and to build a group of states and capability in the region. The famous, Shiite arc of whatever they used to call that.
Shiite crescent. But we need to stop for a minute, because we got to go to the next part, Jamie. We got to stop.
Let's stop and go to the next part.
Because this is important, because, could it also become a failed state? And what will that mean? Anybody remember Iraq? We'll talk about it in the next part. Okay, welcome back to the conversation. In this part of our episode, we want to talk about what's now being much more publicly and openly stated by both Israel and President Trump himself, which is the notion of regime change. We've spoken, Jamie, in the last part, earlier bits of the conversation about what might happen, but that implies that this regime survives, and all the things we talked about is about what this regime might do: go dark, go this, go that. So first and foremost, it's clear that Trump has been pulled into this moment by Netanyahu. There has been deep reporting, notably by the New York Times, about this. So now the question is, since he said this is not about Iran, and his, administration, Hegseth, Vance, all the rest of it said we're not at war with Iran, we're at war with their nuclear program. Now Trump posts that why not regime change if Iran wants to be great again? So again, it's being posited that this is Netanyahu getting into his ear and saying, now's the time, now's the time. Jamie?
Yeah, I think they're not understanding that when the president muses about regime change, that becomes perceived as American policy, because when the president speaks, people pay attention to it. Regime change is a dumb policy. I think if there's anything we learned in the last 20 years, is that trying to organize our diplomacy and our use of military power based on our fundamental interests around questions of regime change is a terrible mistake, because it's got a mixed record. In some cases, it's been successful, a la Serbia briefly after the fall of Kosovo to the Kosovo Albanians, but a mixed record in Libya, an obviously mixed record in Iraq, and a mixed record in Afghanistan. So regime change is not a sensible way to go. The Israelis are exaggerating the ability of military power to bring down the regime. I don't believe that outside forces can bring down this regime. I believe that that will only happen when the people of Iran reach a threshold in which they are forcing their regime to change. Mm-hmm. That's possible. But in this circumstance, that's not the way it happens. And we've seen, Christiane, over the last 20 years, what happens when the people of Iran try to stand up and change their regime. They get slaughtered by their own security forces. And I would hate to see the president of the United States inspire Iranians to try to protest or demonstrate, if they would in these circumstances, and get slaughtered. and I don't see the regime as about to fall. And I think organizing ourselves around that is a terrible mistake. We need to figure out how to end this war. The Israelis can't figure it out. I read today that they're looking to bring this to a close, but how are you going to do it? They have the same problem in Gaza, the same problem all over the Middle East. Their military and intelligence capabilities are extremely successful, but their diplomatic capabilities under Netanyahu are a colossal failure. We should never have been in this situation if Netanyahu had made the right decisions about Gaza.
Really? What do you mean?
I mean that he could have ended the war in Gaza, put in place an Arab force, and gotten Saudi recognition of Israel and ended the conflict between Israel and its neighbors if he would just do the right thing in Gaza. But he won't do that because of his coalition and his own personal situation. And so the war in Gaza rolls on, dozens of people dying every day without any attention being paid to it because of the war in Iran. Mm-hmm. And now the same is going on in Iran. It's been whatever number of days, and they're bombing every day, and now they're hitting clearly not nuclear targets or military targets. Evin prison is not a military target. It's a regime target. And it's designed to promote regime change, and it's madness.
Okay. So as we're talking, I just wanted to read something by Muhammad Ali Abtahi. Now, he is a reformist political mullah in Iran, and he was the reformist president, Mohammad Khatami's chief of staff. So I known him, pretty well, even though I haven't been in touch for a little bit. But he was in touch with the wonderful journalist Farnaz Fasihi from the New York Times, who is the most plugged in and with the best contacts, even though she's outside of Iran. She talks to everybody there, regime and non-regime and military and, political and all the rest of it. Anyway, Abtahi said that he believes Israel has miscalculated Iran's reaction to the war. He said, and he acknowledged the deep political factions that are typically in sharp disagreement with one another had rallied now behind the supreme leader and their own flag and focused the country on defending itself from an external threat. Israel's attacks, he said, has set off a resurgence of nationalism amongst many Iranians inside and outside the country, including many critical of the government. And this is emerging, as we've probably seen, and anybody can look now, in a torrent of postings all over social media. It's physicians, it's celebrities, it's sports heroes. Iran takes its sports very seriously, especially its national soccer team. Like family, he said, we may not always agree, but Iran's soil is our red line. And I think that's being missed, which is not to say that there won't be a reckoning in the future. There is bound to be a reckoning. But right now, the result of this unprecedented bombardment, including those massive American bombs, which have now been test used on Iran for the first time, is causing a huge amount. And there are hundreds of people who've been killed, including civilians. And I know from my own family that they are nervous, they're worried, they don't know where to run to. And now that it's coming to residential neighborhoods.
And remember, this is the same as happening in Israel. Israeli citizens are dying in large numbers because of Iranian attacks on Israel. So
they would say that's retaliation.
I agree, but I'm just explaining that they're suffering in both countries. The war continues, an air war, which is easy for governments to implement, but hard to figure out how to stop it. So how does this end is the famous question, I think was David Petraeus in the Iraq War. How does this end? Well, it's not obvious. It's not obvious that Donald Trump's administration understands how to use force to back up diplomacy. Not force for its own sake, not force for bragging rights, not force to show everyone how tough you are, but force to achieve an objective by combining it with diplomacy. And because, as you suggested earlier, they've now raised questions as to their legitimacy of their negotiations. If they're just being used as cover to use force, the Iranians are going to be less likely to negotiate with them. But we will get back to the table. The Europeans may end up playing an important role as a broker between the two sides. And something has to be decided to end this war. The Israelis are not going to get regime change, and they're going to figure that out if they haven't already. The United States is not going to get regime change. But The war will continue until a diplomatic solution is developed that deals with the nuclear issue and that deals with the ongoing warfare between Israel and Iran. And Israel, again, as I've said, did great against Hezbollah, wiped out Hamas, saw the regime in Syria fall. They're not going to see the regime in Iran fall. And so they need to get real and do what's right for the people of Israel, which will also be good for the United States, which is to find a way to bring this war to a close. They're not going to get the grand objective of seeing the fall of the Iranian Islamic Republic.
Israel and probably the United States are clearly backing certain horses, like the young Shah of Iran. Some in America and obviously in Israel also believe in the MEK, the Mujahideen Khalq, which they used to be branded as a terrorist organization by the US and the UK. Then they, launched a very successful lobbying campaign portraying themselves as true Democrats and the only people with any heft inside Iran. And they renamed themselves, I believe, at one point it was the Iranian Council of Resistance. But the fact of the matter is that their history is incredibly checkered. These people based themselves in Iraq during the Iran-Iraq war and were perceived as fighting for Iraq and, in fact, working for Iraq. And so the Iranian people have never forgiven them. On the other hand, Israel has most definitely used them and their connections for a lot of the evidence that has been produced inside Iran. For instance, that document back in 2009, which revealed the Fordo nuclear plant. I think that was the MEK that produced.
Yeah, the Israelis
right?
gave it to the MEK, is my recollection.
Gave it. So how did Israel get it?
Well, they get it through all their secret, great intelligence on Iran, which is quite real. Remember,
it is, but they have to have human, right?
I assume they have some.
I thought it was MEK.
I think the Israelis leaked it to the MEK, who leaked it to the world, is my recollection.
Right. Okay.
In any event, it doesn't matter. It was about Fordo, and it came out, and it was significant. Mm-hmm. But the point here is that both those who support the Iranian people, those who support the Israeli people, and those who support the American people, I'm one of those people, want to find a way for this war to end. And for it to end, the leaders have got to realize that force alone cannot achieve their objectives. Remember, we were talking over the weekend. Look at who's running the world now. We have Xi Jinping in China, Vladimir Putin in Russia. We have Ayatollah Khamenei in Iran. We have, these crazy people, leaders who think that they
You have Netanyahu and his extremist coalition,
in Israel,
and Trump and his very right-wing coalition.
They are not very able negotiators of successful diplomatic achievements. That's what worries me.
Mm-hmm. And, some have said, like this week, as we record, the Iranian foreign minister has been in Russia. He met with Vladimir Putin, but it looks like they're not going to get any military help from Russia because there was no defense pact signed, and Russia's pretty much made it clear, we support you diplomatically, but not militarily. So Iran has very, very few friends. But Jamie, because we're talking about what might come next, people like our friend Vali Nasser, who's a long-time expert on Iran, wrote the book on the Shiites, was a government official. He's very concerned about a failed state. All those other states you talked about where regime change didn't work very well, Iraq, Syria, Libya, Afghanistan, these fell into failed state status. And it was a disaster, not just for the people there, but for the security of the world and the US and Israel and us and everywhere. And so that's what's very frightening for people who look at the day after.
Let me suggest that I understand Vali's concern and a lot of people's concern. I don't see that as the outcome here. I think the Iranian regime has sufficient control over its country and its people. I think, as you pointed out,
no, I'm talking about if it collapses.
Well, it's not going to collapse, is my opinion.
Why do you think not? Because some people think it will.
They are well established in their rule of Iran. I don't think it's going to collapse. I'm prepared to make that prediction. Certainly not in the coming weeks and months. Years from now, I certainly hope so. But but not in the coming weeks and months. And
I'm not so
instead
sure.
of worrying about a failed state in Iran, which is not something we can do anything about, we should worry about ending the conflict. How does Israel and Iran come to an agreement to stop the war, to stop
But Jamie,
the
they
shelling,
will say
to stop the
that
bombing?
the only way to do that is to remove the regime. I'm quoting them, and Trump is saying the same thing, as in so many words.
I think the Israelis.
Or do we think
if
Trump is being pulled along by the Israelis?
I don't know. Certainly, he's gone farther in terms of launching a war in the Middle East than he claimed to his supporters during the campaign. But I don't think the Israeli government, in the end, is going to wait to stop. In other words, I don't think they're going to keep going until the regime falls. I think they're going to realize sooner rather than later that the regime isn't falling, that the people are rallying around the regime, even people who don't like them very much, as like the person you quoted, and that the regime is not going to collapse. It may be weaker, and it may get weaker and weaker, and that may not be good for anybody, because remember, they have inherent in their capabilities. They've always had a split government. Mm-hmm. There's been the Iranian elected government of presidents and ministers, et cetera, and then they had Khamenei, the IRGC, the Al-Quds Force, and that part of the Iranian regime supports terrorism and has funded terrorism, has been a state sponsor of terrorism. If they now sponsor terrorism, we're all going to be really sorry that President Trump got involved. I hope that doesn't happen. We need to be ready for it. We need to step up our security preparations. And that's what's worrying. I don't want an America to become overly worried about terrorism with a Donald Trump administration who's prepared to exceed all norms of behavior towards privacy and protection of individual rights in the United States. He's the last president I want to be acting the way the United States did after 9/11. That would be a real tragedy.
Okay, I think we should end here for the moment. Move. You take a break because it's so heavy, this subject. It's so heavy. And figure out some of the consequences, some of the blowback, and what actually might happen next, including Iran pulling out of the NPT, the Non-Proliferation Treaty, and if, as you say, the regime survives. And by the way, I put that to the Deputy Foreign Minister, Majid Ravanchi, also a lead negotiator. And I said, if you survive, and he said, we will survive, are you going to go nuclear? And he said, no, Christiane, we will never do that.
I hope he's right. I hope his decisions and his opinion counts.
Take a break. We'll be back. We're back. Final part of our discussion this episode. And we want to talk about what's next. And we want to know and discuss really whether there will be some kind of regime change, or will diplomacy be given a chance, and will it work? So Trump, when he visited the Middle East not so long ago in Saudi Arabia, he gave a speech against, in his words, all those American presidents who believed in intervention and nation building, and look how well it turned out for them. In other words, not. And he said, in his 2016 campaign, called the invasion of Iraq a big fat mistake, the result of, he said, deliberate act of deception by U.S. intelligence. They lied, he said, during a Republican primary debate that February. They said there were weapons of mass destruction. There were none, and they knew there were none. Okay, Jamie, I know, but here he is doing the same thing at a time when the intelligence has said that they do not have that, as we've discussed.
There is an eerie ring to it with Donald Trump accepting Israeli intelligence about Iran's nuclear program. That's Israeli intelligence, which is sometimes brilliant, as we've seen, but sometimes completely wrong, as they were on October 7th, having no clue that Hamas was going to attack them from the south, and moving all their forces to the West Bank. That was what made Israel vulnerable. That was Israeli intelligence too. Look, I don't think the Israeli intelligence argument that Iran was rushing to weaponize its nuclear material is accurate. It's not accurate based on what I saw up till 6 months ago. And the U.S. intelligence community folks have repeated that in recent weeks. So I don't think anything's changed. So Trump has used intelligence to launch military strikes in just the same way that he said the Bush administration did. We can get into whether they were lying or not another day. But for now,
they never found weapons of mass destruction.
That's true. Whether they were lying is a whole other question.
Right.
Whether they were lying or just
I'm saying
wrong.
what Trump said. Anyway.
Yeah. if there is any good news, is that the Europeans have stood up, in the case of Ukraine, to play a role in the world. Now we need them to stand up and be a bridge between the United States and Iran, and between Israel and Iran. We need European diplomats to play a role.
Ooh, stop. We've got this incredible soundbite from Chancellor Merz.
Yeah, let's play
this
that
is
one.
pretty amazing. Let's play it.
Yes, the dirty work that Israel did here. I can only say that I have the highest respect that the Israeli army was courageous enough, that the Israeli government was courageous enough to do this.
Well, maybe it won't be German diplomats who do it.
Ooh, and listen, JB, I'm sorry. Of course, Iranians were furious at being called the dirty work. I mean, the people.
Right.
But also Trump, and this is just an aside, Trump, when he made his speech...
They want to talk to us. Yeah.
No, that, but also in his speech to the nation, he said, I think, and I'm paraphrasing, congratulations. I was a team with Benjamin Netanyahu. Congratulations to the Israeli military. God bless Israel. I mean, all right, if you want to say that to your domestic constituency, but how do you think that goes down in the Muslim world? No, seriously.
Agreed that it will be hard for the U.S. to be immediately accepted as a mediator by the Iranians because of it being appeared that they were used as a device to develop tactical surprise and against the Iranians.
And to do Israel's work.
And to do Israel's work, maybe
actually,
not the Germans.
The dirty work that the Germans say.
Well, right. And look, as complicated as this issue is, it's important to try to be lucid. I am glad that Iran's enriched uranium some of it is destroyed.
But that's still a question we don't know because they
some
say
of it
they
has
may
surely
have
been destroyed.
removed
That's why
it.
I said it that way, not all of it. But I believe that in order to be sure Iran doesn't go nuclear, we need a diplomatic solution that will last for the long term. The kind of solution that Donald Trump ruined by pulling out of the Obama agreement back in his first term. We need another agreement. We need another agreement that will allow the Israelis to stand down, the Iranians to stand down, and the United States to not be suffering blowback from an Iranian support for terrorism. That's what we need. How are we going to get it? My best guess, as I said, is it will be some European leaders, like the British foreign minister who seemed to have a good discussion with Trump before he went back and began to negotiate. I think we need someone like that, the British, maybe the French, to convince the Iranians and the Israelis and the United States together to stand back from force and to let diplomacy do its work. If we don't have that, we're going to be in for long-term airstrikes on Iran and airstrikes on Israel. And I don't think the Israeli people will stand for it forever. I think there are increasing signs that Israeli officials recognize they don't know how to end this and that they are suffering too.
So as I said, they might have, quote unquote, kicked this can down the line, as we discussed, with Vance using terms like delayed, not Trump's word obliterated. But of course, the other question is, you remember after the 8-year Iran-Iraq war, then supreme leader and the father of the Islamic Revolution, Ayatollah Khomeini, said that he basically was forced to drink from the poison chalice. But after 8 years, they fought to a draw. Nobody won.
And
a million
the lesson from that was they would take a lot of suffering, that it
right.
took many, many, many years for that chalice to be drunk from.
Mm-hmm.
That's
and of course,
what I'm
that
worried
was
about.
way before in
right,
the
that's
early
what I'm
days.
worried about is exactly that they can take a lot of pain. The Israelis can take a lot of pain, and this thing can go on for a long, long time. And unless some leadership is shown by somebody somewhere to figure out how to marry force and diplomacy, we're going to be into a long-term conflict with the Israeli people suffering, the Iranian people suffering, and potentially, I pray not, the American people suffering.
And of course, the question then is, will Khamenei, the current supreme leader, who's apparently renamed and reinserted a whole new layer of military commanders, who has written his own will, who has produced some names for mullahs, ayatollahs who would replace him.
To succeed him, yeah.
Yeah, to succeed him if he's taken out. Will he drink from that poison
I sure hope so.
chalice?
I hope so, but I wouldn't bet on it.
And then what happens when Trump says, if he doesn't, i.e., the Iranians have to now make peace or else we have many more targets and it'll be a tragedy and et cetera, et cetera?
I think it's a much different case, and this is why I thought it was important what J.D. Vance said. He was distinguishing between a war against Iran's nuclear program and a war against Iran. I think it's possible we could probably hit Fordo again, but I don't think it's going to make that big a difference. But I don't think the United States, even under Donald Trump's administration, wants to engage in a war against Iran. And so long as Iran doesn't retaliate through shutting down the Strait of Hormuz or blocking oil facilities or attacking the Saudi oil facilities or weaponizing their terrorist organizations and attacking the United States. So long as that doesn't happen, I don't think the U.S. is going to move from nuclear targets to general targets the way the Israelis have. And the Israelis can't do this forever. Remember, they have planes flying every day. They have
you say that 20 years of attrition, 20 months of attrition against Gaza. I mean, Ehud Barak, the former prime minister, obviously a military commander in his day and a defense minister, said he really hopes, to your point, Jamie, that this does not become a war of attrition between Israel and Iran. But here's the other thing to worry about is, and you saw it in the Clinton administration, in the Obama administration, in the Biden administration, and people have raised it, is America's national security and its national interests always Israel's? Because there's been complaints that Israel is often, wagging the dog, so to speak, right, and that it certainly in this case has managed to get a U.S. president to do what no other U.S. president has done.
And I think on this program twice now, and let me do it a third time, what the Trump administration ought to do is to leverage our involvement and support for Israel in this long war for a change in Israel's policy in Gaza. There is a way out. There is a plan that Secretary Blinken put together with many Arab leaders and Israeli leadership of putting in place a force in Gaza, pulling Israeli troops out, stopping the war in Gaza, which will open up many, many opportunities for Israel to be accepted in the region. That needs to be front and center, or else we have a war of attrition in Gaza and a war of attrition in Iran, and all the great success the Israeli military has had all over the region may be lost in a long-term war of attrition.
Okay, so last point. The Iranians, as you started to say, chickens are coming home to roost, et cetera, but they're also often accused of over-negotiating, thinking they're so, able to get, the ultimate deal, et cetera. So you talk about diplomacy, but even in the Biden administration, they tried to bring Iran back into a nuclear deal after we've discussed Trump pulled out. Okay, why? Because this is instructive for the future.
Because of two reasons. One, I think we perhaps we didn't find a way to answer their question of what happens if Trump's elected again and he pulls out of the agreement. That was their main
legitimate
point.
Question
and a fair question. How could it not be? And again, reminding everyone that Trump has just destroyed the very facilities. It wouldn't have mattered if he hadn't pulled out of the Obama Accord. So it is hard, but now Trump is the negotiator, and that might make it easier because if he agrees to it, there's not someone they need to worry about. We were unable to answer that question, and the Iranians were unable to make real compromises on their enrichment program. Remember, they don't need enriched uranium to 60%. They don't need it for a civilian nuclear program. They need it for bragging rights. And maybe bragging rights won't be so important to them anymore. And maybe someone, whether it's the IAEA or the French or the British, can get involved in getting Iran temporarily to stop enrichment while they figure out where all their stuff is, allow the IAEA to come back in, and in exchange get the Israelis to stand down and the United States to stand down. That's the deal that's waiting to be made. It will be very hard to do when bombs are flying and missiles are flying every day back and forth.
All right, Jamie, the X, bye-bye. Thank you very much.
And goodbye to the other X.
Moving situation. And, we've raised and tried to answer a lot of questions, but also admitted that there is so much that we just don't know. A lot is speculation right now. And the real big question is, what will Iran do next? So thanks for listening. Make sure you're following the feed so you never miss an episode. And we'll see you on Thursday, of course, for our bonus episode where we answer your questions, which you send in on social media and via email. So email us at amanpourpod@global.com or find us on social media at amanpourpod. And you can always listen to me, Christiane Amanpour, and the X-Files with you, Jamie Rubin, on Global Player. And of course, download it from the App Store or go to globalplayer.com. Thank you all. Bye.